Do you know how to answer this question? What is life like when war is over? What is life like when war is over? You know, there are some people alive today who don't know how to answer that question. And it's not because they've always lived in a time of peace. It's because they live in countries that have always, for their entire lifespans, been in a time of war. They don't know what it's like for war to be over. They don't know what it's like to rebuild from the desolation, because desolation is constant. And for them, we can only hope and pray that God might bring peace one day. However, even for those who have served in wars in which our country has fought, we might find that those who have served in such war sometimes have a difficult time acclimating back into the so-called normalcy of life. They, in a sense, find themselves rebuilding a life from the ground up. They, in a sense, find that when they come back, even though everything is fine here, stateside, they themselves are not fine. And they need counsel and they need help. They need a time of rebuilding. And the truth is, it's been a very long time since an entire war was fought on our own American soil. But I want you for a second to think back to maybe history that you've read, images that you've seen from movies, of what it might have been like to go back home after the American Revolution was over, after the Civil War was over. What would it be like to rebuild from the rubble that once you called your home? The entire book of Haggai is only 2 chapters long. It covers the time span of several months in one single year, in the year 520 BC. And this was 9 years after King Cyrus of Persia had announced that the people who had earlier, during the time of Daniel, been exiled from Judah. You can remember Jeremiah. Jeremiah is the weeping prophet. He's the one that sees the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. And during the time of Daniel, we see that all of those remaining, especially the young and the healthy, they were taken away into captivity in Babylon. And then later in Daniel's life, King Haggai believes that the people can go back. Now, this doesn't mean that Jerusalem can go and rebuild and just be their own entity again. No, they will still be under Persia's rule, under Babylon's control. But Judea will have some say in their everyday order of life. They're allowed to go back to their homeland. They're allowed to go back into their city. They're allowed to rebuild and even to worship as they see fit. So some of the exiled Judeans, but really some of the descendants of the exiled Judeans, begin their trek towards Jerusalem. The same Jerusalem that had been left in ruins during the time of Jeremiah. The returning Judeans essentially were allowed to go home to a pile of rubble and then tasked, on your own, as you can, rebuild. Rebuild this city. You would think, okay, well, we can do that. We can gather as a people. Unfortunately, this was anything but a peaceful return to where they once lived. As the exiles returned, they were met with conflict. Conflict with those who had remained among the rubble who didn't leave. Those who had moved into the demolished city during the exile. And one of the major sources of conflict was in regards to rebuilding their place of worship, the temple. In the first chapter of Haggai, some of the recently returned exiles suggest that the temple rebuilding was going way too fast. There were other priorities. There weren't enough resources. There wasn't enough money to go around to do all of the things, and people were putting way too much focus on the house of God. This money was going to run short, and the temple was not going to be good enough. It was never going to be able to be what it was in the height of King Solomon. There was no way they were going to be able to do the work adequately, and what they would be left with would be nothing in comparison to what it was. And in the same regard, the people were worried about their own homes. If we give all of our time and our energy and our resources towards building the house of God, well, what's left for us? Where is my family going to live? Where am I going to settle? Because my house is also a pile of rubble. There were plenty of people who wanted to voice their opinion that they could not do the project. It's too hard of an undertaking. Let's give up and not worry about it. God will still be God. Let's worry about us. But then the prophet Haggai comes on the scene. And the word of the Lord is with him, and Haggai proclaims to the people, how is it that it's the right time for you to live in fine new homes while the temple of God sits in ruin? How is it that you, people who worship God, can live in wonderful homes that you have built with your own hands while the temple of God is in ruin? Eugene Peterson, in the Message version of the Bible, puts it this way in chapter 1, verses 5, beginning with verse 5. And then a little later, the God of the angel army spoke out again. Take a good hard look at your life. Think it over. You've spent a lot of money, but you haven't much to show for it. You keep filling your plates, but you never get filled up. You keep drinking and drinking and drinking, but you're always thirsty. You put on layer after layer of clothes, but you can't get warm. And the people who work for you, what are they getting out of it? Not much. A leaky, rusted out bucket. That's what. That's why the God of angel armies says, take a good, hard look at your life and think it over. Then God said, here's what I want you to do. Climb into the hills and actually cut down some timber. Bring it down and rebuild the temple. Do it just for me. Honor me. You've had great ambition for yourselves, but nothing has come of it. The little that they have brought to my temple, I've blown away because there was nothing to it. And why? Because while you've been running around, caught up with taking care of your own houses, my home is in ruins. That's why. Because of your stinginess. And so I've given you a dry summer and skimpy crops. I've matched your tight-fisted stinginess by decreeing a season of drought, drying up fields and hills, withering gardens and orchards, stunting vegetables and fruit. Sometimes I really don't like Eugene Peterson's The Message because he puts it in a way that makes it feel attacking, doesn't it? But the truth is, this is what happens when people forget about God. This is what happens when people forget about God. And we can look to our world today. We can look to a time in which statistics say 35% of the population actually come to church on Sunday morning on a regular basis. And that's unfortunate, too, when we say a regular basis, because in a generation past, a regular basis of church attendance meant that you were here 50 out of 52 Sundays. You might have had a Sunday off for a vacation. You might have had a Sunday off because you were sick. 50 out of 52 was regular church attendance. You know what they consider regular church attendance now? If you show up once a month. Do you know what that is? That's 12 times a year. 12 times a year is regular church attendance. Wow. And that's not to say that we have to be at church to think about God. I know plenty of people that say that I would rather be on the lake fishing thinking about God than in the church thinking about fishing in a boat. And you may resemble that remark. I don't know. I like to fish too, but I'm here. The truth is, God is everywhere. But there's something about our faith that is renewed when we come together and join in the community. In fact, it's why the scriptures say, don't disparage meeting together. It's important for us to come together, to remind each other of God, to remind each other of why we're here, to take a moment to give thanks for all the wonderful things God has done in our lives and to give back. And Haggai speaks from the Lord and tells the people, God says you're being selfish. And sometimes we might think that's offensive. To think that when we would have so little, when we're trying to build a life and a home for ourselves, when we're trying to unmask the amounts of debt that we have gathered for ourselves, we think when we have so little, what we would even begin to think about sharing with God, it wouldn't be enough to do anything anyway. We begin to wonder and argue, does God not see the state of my life? Does God not see my status? Does God not hear my cries of pain? Does God not realize that we have been serving as slaves in a foreign land? We finally get to come back home, and then we fight tooth and nail just to get by, just to survive, and God's upset that we're putting ourselves first? Yes. Because the generation that put themselves first is why Babylon conquered Jerusalem in the first place. It's a little painful to hear, but the truth is, we do put ourselves first, and often probably more than we realize. When we consider what our homes and our families need before we think about the church, when we seek to fill our own stomachs and are constantly in want for more that this world has to offer, and without notice, we are completely forgetting about God. Even when our lives are in good order, we forget what God has asked for. We forget that the tithe, the 10%, it's an asking. It's the beginning of what it is to be generous beyond ourselves. If we really wanted to look at the mandate of Scripture, we would probably hear Jesus' words speaking louder and louder. Go and sell all that you have and distribute it to the poor, and then follow me. People say, well, the tithe, that's the 10%. That's kind of been biblical. It's been around since Genesis, and it's kind of the model, right? And then Jesus comes on the scene, and he busts all of that. Time and time again, he tells you to go and sell all that you have. In Acts chapter 2, when the early church is starting, it says that they all gathered together, and everyone sold their possessions, and they shared with each other as everyone had need. That goes so far beyond just thinking about, the 10%. And we worry about whether I'm going to consider 10% of net or gross. And then we wonder, well, I'll give 10% if there's 10% left at the end of the month. Where's the balance? How do we find that place that pleases God? I think the first thing we have to do in that is to realize and ask ourselves the question, does my life reflect the love of God that I've known? When we look at Haggai, and I know it's not a place that we often want to look, we see that the prophet is reminding us, as well as the church then, of the former glory of the temple. He's reminding the people of God of the temple that Solomon had built, of the time when they were on top. And there's a call to remember what God had previously done. When we were nothing more than faithful to what God had called us to do, God reminds the people, do you not remember what it was like for the generations that came before you that were in slavery once again in Egypt? I've pulled people out of slavery once before. And you know what? In that time, they really had nothing. In that time, I was perfectly happy with them putting up a temporary tent that they moved from place to place that was a time of worship. It's not about the place that you're building. It's not about the splendor. It's about where your heart is, and are you dedicated to love the God who saves? It's a call for us to be faithful, to remember that God did all the wonderful things in this place. It's like what we've heard in these moments of thankfulness, all of the reasons for which we are thankful that God has given us a church in Rocky Hill to be a beacon of light. Faithful. The people who have built up this place, faithful with the blessings that they had received, faithful in their thanksgiving to God, faithful to have courage to believe that God was going to make a way when it didn't seem like it was possible. Haggai reminds us, sometimes uncertain people, about the Exodus traditions, about the time when there was nothing. And that even when there was nothing, God's great act of salvation was leading people from slavery into freedom. God is doing that over and over and over again. And God promises that the last generation hasn't seen this. Generation after generation are going to see freedom. But you got to put your focus on the divine. The affirmation here is that the future will align with the past covenant, but God is surely going to build us up once more, and it's going to be better than ever. It's going to be better than ever. Because even when the temple does get rebuilt, it gets destroyed again. And then we enter Jesus, the reason we're all here. And he says, if this temple is destroyed, I will rebuild it in 3 days. And he hopefully hopes us to see that it was never about buildings in the first place. It was about a people who believed in something greater, who came together to see what God would do through them as they gave of themselves for a kingdom that they haven't seen yet, knowing that God was with them all the way. It's about dedication and faithfulness to the God who leads us and them, who lifts us up, who saves us, for us what God has done in the past, how God has blessed the ministries that have happened here, how God has built up a people of faith in this place, and even now there are faithful who want to see it thrive. And how we can remain faithful in our gifts to God. How we can seek to continue to be a place where peace and truth and the grace of God would be deeply rooted and spread broadly throughout this community and into this world. It's about remembering that God is the reason we are thankful. God is the reason for this place. May God be remembered and praised through our faithfulness to Christ alone.